Today, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about Cursor. It's an extremely powerful AI-powered vibe coding tool that's similar in a lot of ways to lovable.dev, but gives you a lot more freedom, can make you a lot more productive, but requires just a little bit more knowledge to get set up and used properly. Along the way, I'm going to explain the basics of GitHub, which is an absolutely essential tool for managing different versions of your software and making sure that you can always get unstuck if the AI digs itself into a hole. We're going to be taking a project that I built in lovable.dev. We're going to be bringing it into GitHub. I'm going to explain why we need GitHub, the problems that it solves. Then I'm going to show you guys how to take it out of GitHub, put it into Cursor. Then we're going to make changes locally using Cursor on our desktops. And then we're going to see those changes live in lovable.dev. I'm going to explain everything along the way, all the terminology. I'm going to assume that the only experience you have is very brief using lovable.dev and no programming whatsoever. By the end of the video, you'll have a good grasp on the vocabulary needed and the basic concepts necessary to vibe code successfully, and you'll be able to have the AI help you much more effectively get unstuck. My name's Tommy Eberle. Let's get into the video. So I've got lovable.dev open on my screen, and you can see here that I just had it make a tic-tac-toe app, and then I went in and I said, let's change the colors from what was the original purple into green. And if you ever used Lovable before, you'll know that it's going to display your app on the right and you've got your chat on the left. And if we look over here, it indeed seems like it works. So I've got what looks like tic-tac-toe here. We can see that player O wins, and it looks like I can reset. It looks pretty nice. Impressive that I can do this in one shot. But I want to talk about what does it mean to actually write code in the first place. It sounds like a silly question, but if you go into Lovable and click on this little code viewer up here with the angle brackets, we're going to be greeted with the actual code itself. And code is actually just a set of files in a directory. So if we look over here, we can see all of the files that actually encompass the code that we're talking about. And we can read this as, this is index.html, this is .getignore, this is components.json. And again, don't worry here if none of these file names make sense, if everything on the right looks like complete gibberish. I just want to illustrate what code is at a high level because that's going to come in handy later, trust me. We also have folders within our top level folder. So this entire folder contains not just these files we see here, but it also contains folders itself. So we see source, we see source/app.css, source/app.tsx, we see source/components/tic-tac-toe/gameboard.tsx. So you can see here that we can nest folders pretty much as deep as we want. Now, when we tell Lovable to make changes, so when we say modify the color scheme, what Lovable really is doing under the hood is it's got access to all these files and it's figuring out which of the files actually corresponds to the color setting, and it's going and making the appropriate changes. So again, you don't need to know where that file lives, but you do need to know that when you're asking Lovable to do something, really what it's doing is just modifying a file. And on the right-hand side, we can see the contents of these files. And I know they look a little scary. We've got these different colors going on. That's called syntax highlighting. And you're going to notice that that's different based on the file extension. But all of these files ultimately are just text. So what we see here is at really what the computer is going to see, at least at a high level. And when Lovable is actually modifying these files, all that it's doing is just rewriting some of the text. Now, of course, if you're not a programmer, you probably don't want to be modifying these files yourself, but it is good to know that we're really just talking about text. And when we're talking about the project, we're talking about the entire directory. And anytime Lovable makes a change, there's a good chance that it's going to have to modify more than one file to actually affect the change that you're looking for. So when we're talking about pulling the code into Cursor or pulling the code somewhere, really what we need to do is send this entire directory with all of the files over to whoever wants the code if they want to be able to run it or modify it themselves. And let's back up a little bit and let's actually go into Google Drive. And I have what I'm calling the super important project. And let's open important doc v1, and then we're going to open important doc v2. Now, in important doc v1, again, the contents aren't really that important. We have, it just says, hey, and then a bunch of gibberish. And then important doc v2, we have, hey there, I'm excited to work on this. Now, pretend like this was some important document at work that you had to spend a few weeks drafting, and you were going to send it to your manager, and he was going to give you feedback based on what he thought was good for the document. You probably want a way to look back at previous versions of your file and be able to kind of diff the two and compare what the changes were, because maybe you actually have to go back in time and find a change that you removed and bring it back into your project. Now, in this case, obviously the document's very small, it's very contrived, but pretend like we had a large document. This kind of system is called versioning, and basically that's why we have these V1 in the document. And if we go into super important project, if I wanted to create V3, I could maybe do something like create a copy of this And then I could go in, modify it how I like, and then name it v3. This is how you would version a document. And even if the document's really long, it's often just going to be self-contained in a single file. And that's why this sort of system, while it's a little painful to maintain, would work. You could just create a new copy every time, and maybe you have V7, V8, whatever. And if you've ever been in college or worked on one of these projects, you probably had a situation where you had like report underscore final, exclamation, whatever. You know what I'm talking about there? Basically, you had to invent your own versioning system. Now let's go back to the code for a little bit, and let's think about how we would do that in a world where instead of just having a single file corresponding to our project, we actually have an entire directory that corresponds to a bunch of files that correspond to our project. So when Lovable goes and makes a change, it actually might affect multiple different files. And if we want to have like this different versions, if we want to have a concept of versions, our system's going to have to get a lot more sophisticated. So that's where GitHub's going to come in. And you could think of GitHub kind of as Google Drive for code. And basically, it's a place to store projects. It's a place where different people can access the code. They can download them, sort of like Google Drive. Although there are some very important differences that we'll get into. GitHub is just a website. You can create an account, super easy to sign up. I'm not going to go through with that. I'm not going to go through that with you guys today. But what we are going to do is in Lovable, you're going to see this GitHub icon. I think it's a little cat. He's cute, I suppose. We'll hit connect GitHub, and it should be pretty straightforward. You're gonna wanna connect your accounts. I've already done that here. This is very straightforward. I'm not gonna go over that, but you can click connect project, and you're gonna click on your profile. So that's me there, T. Eberle. I'm already signed in. And what this is gonna do is create a project in GitHub with all the code. So let's actually go over to GitHub. We're going to refresh my page. And now we're gonna notice on the left-hand side, I guess we don't see it. What did I name it? It's called tic-tac-toe. So let's type in tick. And we see tic-tac-toe, oops. So I don't know why I named it tic-tac-toe, oops, but it did. And now what we're greeted with is the code itself. And again, think of this like Google Drive. And now we're gonna just do a side-by-side comparison so you can see what I'm talking about. So do we see here, .gitignore, readme.md, and let's go into Lovable. And again, we're on the code viewer. We see .gitignore, and we see readme.md. And let's actually look at the contents of readme.md. And again, don't worry about what these files are, but we're gonna see welcome to your Lovable project, welcome to your Lovable project, project info, URL. So this is the exact same file. On GitHub, we're formatting a little differently. And then actually, if you'll notice here, this view that we see in GitHub, this file tree, is very similar to the view that we see in Lovable. So all of the files here are going to be present in GitHub. Well, almost all the files. Don't worry about that. But basically, the entire project is going to be here. And so what we've done is we've actually created a copy of this repository, and we put it into GitHub. Now, the thing with GitHub is it's not just Google Drive where it gives us a live state of a project. It also tracks a history of our projects. So if we look here, we have what's called branches. Now, if you're just getting started, you're just gonna work on the main branch. Don't worry about that. Branches allow you to have different threads of work going on in parallel at the same time. That's an advanced concept. I'll make a video about that later. But within a branch, you have what's called a commit. And if you ever played a video game and you had to save and make checkpoints, a commit can be thought of as a checkpoint in your app. If we look here, let's actually click on the specific commit. So you can click on the message here, and the commit is going to contain a set of changes along with a message and an author. So we can see here that lovable.dev bot was the author of this commit, and that kind of makes sense because that was me going in here and telling Lovable to adjust the color scheme. And it's going to contain a message, and Lovable wrote this message. You, the author, can make this whatever you want. Often in software projects, the messages are not helpful. They're really just there for anyone who's looking at what happened in the past to see what happened. So Lovable said, update color scheme, change the application's color scheme to green. Then within the commits, we're also going to see the set of files that changed. So in Lovable, we see the entire project. And if we back out of GitHub, we're also going to see the entire project. But just like how in Google Docs, you can do what's called, I think it's a suggesting mode where you can basically go in and make changes and you're going to see like a diff view. So you can see here, like if I add this stuff, we're going to get this little diagram here and we're going to see that I added changes and I think we're going to get specific highlights. That allows us to see how a document has evolved over time. Just like that in GitHub, if you click on a specific commit, excuse me, that was actually the Lovable profile. If you click on a specific commit, it's going to display to you not the entire project, it's going to display to you the files that actually changed and the files that are relevant for that commit. So you can see here that in order for it to modify the color scheme, all it had to do was modify index.css. And if we look at this view, we're going to notice we see line numbers on the left-hand side, and then we're going to see red where it modified, where it removed, and green where it added. And so we can read this change as lovable.dev, change the file source/index.css, and it removed line 20 and it replaced it with this. It removed line 22 and replaced it with this, and then so on for 30, 38, blah, blah, blah. And this view is not that different from the view you see here where it's like, okay, this is an addition. I think if we cross that out, okay, so the color green I think is just happenstance, but you get the idea. There's different visual displays for you to be able to see the changes. Now, you don't necessarily need to be viewing the changes. Cursor might be and Lovable might be. That's going to come in handy later. But I want to illustrate to you guys what we're talking about when we say version control and what we're talking about when we're talking about tracking changes. Also notice that a commit has a timestamp. So this was 16 minutes ago, and this is going to be immutable. So basically what that means is throughout the lifetime of our project, anytime we made a checkpoint, we're going to have a gigantic list of all those checkpoints. And if we so wanted to, we could actually bounce around to different points in time. And this is going to come in hand a lot later when you're having the AI make a bunch of changes and you don't want it to make a change that's going to break your app, or rather you want to let it make a change that could break your app, but you don't want to worry about your app actually being broken forever. So that's why this is going to come in handy. A few other things to note: a commit has what's called a hash or a name. This is going to be generated by GitHub. You don't have to worry about this, but basically this uniquely identifies the commits. It's not really a human readable name. That's why it says 81ED2F3. Again, you would rarely refer to a commit like that, but just know that once it gets a name, it is never going to change ever. And that's going to come in handy later. But this is called the commit hash. This is what a commit is. And if we go over here, this is generally what's going on with GitHub. So when you open a GitHub project, you're going to see a live view of the code. Now, where else do Google Drive and GitHub differ? Well, in Google Drive, often you have what's called a live view. So everybody's looking at the exact same document. And if you've ever used a Google Doc with more than one person, you know that you'd see their little circle up here. You would see their cursor as well. And you guys would be able to see the changes live, like you'd literally be editing the same file together. Now with Git and GitHub, it's very different. In this model, everything is decentralized. And what that means is on GitHub, I have a full copy of all of the history of the code. So not just the latest commit, but literally everything that's ever happened. And this copy is disconnected from Lovable. Now, of course, there is a connection created by Lovable, but if you go in here and modify the file in Lovable, you are not going to see that live in GitHub because you are not modifying the same thing. That is going to be a completely different copy of the file. And if you want to apply those changes to GitHub, you have to explicitly push them up. So you push changes, that means upload, and you pull changes, that means download, and that has to happen explicitly. Realistically, if you're a vibe coder, the AI is going to do all this for you, but it's good to know these concepts at a high level and at least some of the vocabulary. So it's decentralized. GitHub is not a live view. And unlike Google Drive, where you would actually go in and this is not just a place to store files, but it's really a place to edit files, you rarely, if ever, will edit the files in GitHub. You will probably use Lovable or Cursor or some other text editor, but it's very, very rare that you would actually edit the files in GitHub. And if you're just a beginner, I would ignore almost every tab up here other than code. If you go over to settings, that's going to come in handy if you want to invite somebody. So you can go into collaborators, and then I don't really want to do the two-factor, but basically you can invite another account, maybe somebody by email. So if you want to share your project with a colleague or somebody or like a developer, you would need to go into settings and give them access here. And then they would actually download the entire repository, which I'll show you guys how to do in a second. Okay, so that's GitHub at a high level. We're gonna go into Cursor now because we need to pull in the project from GitHub. And so basically we need to set up that connection. So if we go over here into Cursor, I've opened it up. This is a brand new window in Cursor. So basically we don't have a project open. What we're gonna do is instead of open project, which would be anything on your local file system, we're gonna clone the repository. And if you do this, you're gonna see the clone from GitHub button. Let's go ahead and click on this. And then this is gonna pull up everything that we saw when I was logged into my account. And I've already logged into GitHub and Cursor. I'm not gonna go over that, but basically you just do the standard login process. It's very straightforward. And then you are going to grab the name of the repository that you want. And then I have a top level directory called code where I have all of my code repos. I like to put it there, but this is completely up to you. So I'm gonna say select as repository destination. And now let's go ahead and open up this repository. And now we're gonna notice, we're gonna have a view that should look familiar. So let me bump the font so you guys can see it a little better. But on the left-hand side, what do we have? Well, that's the file browser again. So we have index.html, we have readme.md, we have package.json. Let's go back to GitHub. We have index.html, we have readme.md, we have package.json. Let's go to Lovable. We have index.html, we have readme.md down here, and we have package.json. And I want to illustrate this because we literally have the exact same code in Cursor now that we had in GitHub and that we also had in Lovable. So on the left-hand side, you're going to get a file browser. I'm not going to install the update right now. And then over here, you're going to get the files themselves. So if we go over into Lovable, that should look very, very familiar. And it should also look very, very familiar to what we have in GitHub. And again, you wouldn't really modify in GitHub. That's why if I type this over here, it's giving me kind of an error. Now in Cursor, if we go over here and type a bunch of stuff, so we'll notice in package.json, we actually have this turned red, and we see this little 2. I think that's actually Cursor telling us there's an error in the file, which makes sense because I just put in a bunch of gibberish. But just to illustrate that this is not like Google Drive where we're not working with a shared view of everything that's live, notice how on line 11 of package.json, after it says Vite preview, we see this random garbage that I typed in here. If we go into GitHub and we type in package.json on line 11, we are not going to see this random garbage because we haven't pushed up our changes. And likewise, in Lovable, if we go into package.json on line 11, we are not going to see that gibberish because, again, it didn't get synced up to GitHub. So let's go ahead and delete that. Now, with Cursor, on the right-hand side, you're going to get the chat window. That is going to be very similar to the chat window that you're going to be used to in Lovable. There's a few different modes. If you're brand new, you probably want to use the agent mode. The agent mode is going to allow Cursor to modify the file system and basically write code for you. That's likely what you want. If you just want to ask it a question, so you want to have more of the standard chatgpt.com or Claude.ai experience where you're kind of just going back and forth, you're better off using Ask, but for the vast majority of you probably want to use agents. I don't recommend manual unless you have a little bit more experience, but basically with manual, you have to explicitly tag the files and you really need to know what you're doing for it to be effective. So for the vast majority of you, I recommend agent. And this add context up here, don't worry too much about it, especially if you're a beginner, but this is what I was talking about where you can attach web pages, you can attach files, other sorts of things that you want in the context window for the LLM to have access to as it's writing your code. Now, on the right-hand side, we're going to get the model dropdown. I do have the $20 a month plan, so I have access to Claude 4 Sonnet. When in doubt, use Claude 4 Sonnet, and this is, I guess I'm filming this in August 2025. I'm sure this will change relatively soon, but Claude 4 Sonnet's pretty good. 3.5 Sonnet is also pretty good. O3 and Gemini 2.5 Pro, also good. But honestly, if you're not sure, use Claude 4 Sonnet. This isn't really meant to be a video about the differences between models, and for the vast majority of what you're doing, that's going to work. I will point out that you can paste in pictures into the chat. That's going to come in handy, like if you want to take a screenshot of something and then paste it in. And that's going to come in handy when we're running the app, and we can have Cursor help us debug by pasting in those pictures. Now, what we're going to want to do is make a change. So I want to actually change the color scheme yet again. So this was, let's see, blank app. What's going on here? Why does it... What happened to my app? That's really weird. So somehow it's completely nuked my app. So we're gonna go along with that. Don't worry about it. What we're gonna do is actually make the app change color. So trust me, the app was green before. Let's make it red. So we're gonna say, let's make the color scheme red. You're gonna click enter, and that is gonna go in and cause the chat to begin. And again, this is gonna look very similar to what we were seeing over here in lovable.dev because honestly, the underlying tech is pretty similar. So anyway, it's gonna go ahead, it's gonna figure out what has to happen here. It's gonna go ahead and actually modify the correct file. So that's looking good. It's gonna make the change, and then we're gonna wanna see it in Lovable. So we're gonna let Cursor finish here. All right, so Cursor's doing its thing, and I also wanna highlight that the view we're seeing here with the red and the green is very similar to the view that we would see in GitHub, the diff view. So remember when we clicked on the commits, this is the view that we get, and we see these red and these greens. This is just a convenient way for programmers to specify what in a particular file has changed. And again, that's very similar to in Google Drive or Google Docs rather, when you have this sort of suggesting view of things. So let's go back into Cursor. It looks like this worked, but the problem is we don't have a way to run this, at least not yet. We want to be able to see our changes live. So what we're going to have to do is push these changes back up into Lovable. And you guessed it, the middleman is going to be GitHub here. So this is what we have. And in order to do this, we're just going to have Cursor go ahead and do that for us. So we can tell Cursor, now push these changes to GitHub. Go ahead and push these changes to GitHub. That's all you're going to have to tell it. And while it's doing that, I want to talk about what's called the terminal. So we see this here. It's running commands. So if we click on the terminal, you're probably never going to use this if you're a novice or if you're just getting started. but I actually want to show you guys what the terminal is. So if you go in here and type in terminal, or if you type in /terminal, we can say create new terminal with profile, and we're going to use bash. It doesn't really matter which one you choose, but just pick the first one, either bash or ZSH if you're on Mac OS. Click on that, and this is what's called a command prompt. And this is probably a little scary if you've never used one, but it is a way to interact with your computer, your file system, the network, everything, using only a command prompt and no graphical interface. So it's going to greet you with your name. You're going to see a bunch of other stuff, and you can basically put in commands here. So for instance, a command that you might put in is ls. That's going to list out the files in your directory. So we're going to see that we see bun.lockb, that's bun.lockb, readme.md. This is the command line. We can also do stuff with GitHub, so that would be with the git command. So if we go up here, we're going to notice that the AI decided to use a command called git commit-m, and that's where we're actually going to see the commit message. Don't worry about understanding all of this at a deep level, but when you're having Cursor do stuff like fetch things from the internet, or when you're having Cursor push up to GitHub or modify files, it's really using the command line under the hood. And I don't bring up the command line to scare you guys, but if you run into any issues, it's helpful to know that it exists. And it's also helpful to know that you can have AI generate commands to do a lot of tasks for you. Now, do be careful, because the command line, as they say, with great power comes great responsibility. And you could absolutely mess up your entire computer, not just deleting files, but really causing problems if you're not super careful. Now, this is unlikely to happen, and I don't really think AI is likely to get that malicious, but just to highlight, if you don't know what you're doing, I would advise against going here. But know that oftentimes what's going to happen is you're going to tell Cursor to do something, and it's going to run a bunch of terminal commands. And terminal, bash, ZSH, command line, they're not exactly synonyms, but for your purposes, if you're a novice, just think of them as synonyms. It's this little view here where you only have a cursor and input text. You have no graphical user interface. Okay, with that out of the way, let's actually go check on GitHub here. So let's go to GitHub. We're going to go back into code, and we're going to notice a few things. Well, first of all, the latest commit, which is displayed here, is now T Eberle, which is my account, instead of lovable.dev. So let's click on the commit, and we see update color scheme to red theme. And then I mentioned that that's where the commit message was put in. It was put in by the AI, and we see here update color scheme to red theme, and then we see the bullet pointed list. So not that this is something you'd be doing yourself, but I wanted to illustrate how that flowed through the system. And we'll notice that it's 2 minutes ago. Like I mentioned, the hash or the unique name of the commit was randomly generated, and it is different than the old commit. Now, if you want to go back in time, you'll notice that every commit has a parent. So if we click on this parent commit, we're going to notice that this was the one that was before. And this is now 30 minutes ago instead of, I think it was 16 minutes ago. Now, this is 3 minutes ago. And then again, we're going to look at what the changes were in the code itself. And what we're going to see here is, again, a very similar view. It modified the same file, which makes sense because this is, I guess, the file that has all the information for the colors in the app. And now let's go into Lovable. And if we take a look here, it was already connected to GitHub. So what Lovable is doing under the hood is it is constantly pinging GitHub, and it's saying, hey, any changes on this repo? Hey, any changes on this repo? And if there are any, it's going to go ahead and download them. So now we're going to notice that we have our tic-tac-toe. It's in red. I have no idea what was happening before. Honestly, I don't really care too much. But anyway, we've got the latest changes. And if we go into the code viewer, let's actually look at, what was that, index.css, source index CSS. So let's go over here, source index CSS, and then let's look at line 12. So we should see background 0197. We're going to see background 0197. So again, this is just to illustrate that the changes have been applied, and that's why we see what we see in Lovable here. Oh, and by the way, when I say repo or repository, a repository refers to not just the code, but the code along with its entire history. And so when we're talking about GitHub, when we're talking about Git, this is a repository. It is not just this snapshot of the code. It is all of the code all across its entire lifetime. And repo is just a synonym for repository, so you might hear that. Anyway, we've got our entire repository. The code is now synced across Lovable and GitHub and Cursor. Now, what if we want to pull in the changes into Cursor from Lovable? So again, let's change the color scheme. Now make it blue. So we're going to have Lovable make it blue, and then I'm going to show you guys how to pull that into Cursor. Spoiler alert, it's really not that hard. Basically what we're going to do is wait for this to finish. Lovable should automatically make a commit, push it up to GitHub, and then we just need to go into Cursor and say, pull the latest changes. Now I'm going to wait on pulling the changes because right now Lovable is still editing the files, and it hasn't actually pushed those changes up to GitHub. And Cursor won't be able to pull from Lovable because Cursor and Lovable are not talking directly. They're using GitHub as this intermediary. All right, Lovable is still doing its thing. It looks like it was able to modify the color scheme to blue. It's honestly been really slow, which isn't that surprising because I'm on the free plan. I actually stopped paying for the pro plan of Lovable. I don't know if I'm super bullish on Lovable as a company. I think a lot of this code gen stuff is becoming pretty commoditized, but that's just my opinion. I also have a lot of experience programming, so I prefer Cursor, or really now I use Claude Code. But anyway, it just changed the color scheme to blue, and we're gonna notice that we get this little chip icon here. This means that it made a commit, and I believe it means it should have pushed it to GitHub. So let's go ahead and refresh. Now we're gonna notice the latest commit, which was just now, is from Lovable. We're gonna click on this guy. Notice that it has a parent. The parent was the commit that I made when I was using Cursor. We're gonna go back here, and now notice on index.css on line 20, it changed it from 07646 to 222.145. If we go over here, let's look at the code. Bear with me here on line 20. We're gonna see 222.145. That's what we're seeing here. Now, if we go into Cursor and we go into source index.css and we go into line 20, we're gonna see 07646. So again, this is just to illustrate that in Cursor, we haven't pulled these changes in yet. And if we were to run the app on Cursor, we wouldn't actually see this. Okay, let's run the app on Cursor before we pull in the changes. And what do I mean by run the app? Well, let's say run the app locally. So again, you don't have to worry about how to do this, but basically in this file package.json, there are very explicit instructions on how to run the app. And what that means is we're gonna be able to have a web browser where we see the app, and we're gonna be able to make changes in Cursor and see changes in the app immediately without having to use Lovable as an intermediary. And I recommend doing this because it's a lot slower to go through Lovable, especially if you're in Cursor. And when you're making software development changes, one of the most important things is being able to work quickly. And if you add on these delays, even if it's like 30 seconds per code change, that starts to add up very, very quickly. So I highly recommend you get this working locally if you can. And luckily, the Cursor, the AI, is going to be able to figure out all the stuff it has to install to make this work. So it's going ahead and going to run that thing. And you're going to notice that it's going to spit out a URL for us to use. So it says local, and I'll explain what this local host and these scary numbers mean, but if we command click, that is gonna open up in our web browser at that URL. So we see how it says localhost :8081/. Now this is the tic-tac-toe game, and again, I wanna illustrate that we don't see the blue, and that's because the code in Cursor was not updated to show the blue. And this is the exact same app. So if you make changes in Cursor, you're gonna be able to see them and get that feedback, add extra players, make the grid bigger, really whatever you wanna do. Just refreshed, that's not so cool. But anyway, what's going on here? So localhost, this is just a fancy programming way to say your computer. So when you type in lovable.dev, your web browser, Google Chrome, is gonna figure out how to go to Lovable's servers and talk to them. So when we're on lovable.dev, we are connected across the internet to Lovable's servers. Now, I don't know where they are, I don't really care, but localhost always refers to your computer. So when Google Chrome sees localhost, it means, oh, you're running something locally. As in, you're just running a server on your laptop. Let me connect there. And this thing here, 8081, that's called the port. So ports are probably only gonna be relevant if you're doing development work, but imagine if we had multiple applications running at once. So I had one Cursor doing a tic-tac-toe simulator, I had another Cursor doing a chess simulator. Well, how would you have multiple apps hosted on one laptop at the same time? That's where the port comes in. And basically we say, okay, localhost, we're gonna call it number 8081. That's where tic-tac-toe lives. And maybe we'd say we're gonna run chess on 8082. Now, I'm not running a chess app on 8082, so now we're gonna see that the site refused to connect. It can't be reached. Even though the host was the same, the port was different. You probably won't run into these issues, and especially in production, you won't, but I wanted to highlight that. So anyway, this is the app. We're running it locally. I highly recommend you run it locally once you get the app into Cursor. Honestly, once you get the app into Cursor and you get everything running, you probably won't need to go back to Lovable. I think Lovable might be a little bit better at some of the design side of things, so maybe there's a reason to pull it in for certain things, but realistically, once you're in Cursor, that's kind of a one-way trip out of Lovable, because anything you can do in Lovable, you can basically do in Cursor as well. Okay, anyway, so now let's make this blue, and again, we don't want to go in here and just say make this blue, because we're not guaranteed that the AI is going to make the exact same changes that we made in Lovable, so what we want to do is say pull the latest changes from GitHub. And now we're going to run a terminal command again, or rather the AI is going to run a terminal command on our behalf. And we're going to notice it says git pull origin main. Don't worry about that. Let's go over into Lovable, our local host. And again, this is local. Now we see it's blue. We go over into Lovable. Now they look exactly the same. And then why don't we actually go into index.css. And then again, that line 20, we see 220, 145. And now that lines up exactly with the change we see here in GitHub. And of course, the code that we see in Lovable. So now that we're in Cursor, you can basically start talking to it as if you were in Lovable, because it's going to work very similarly. Again, you can switch the model, but honestly, what's more important if you're a beginner is just to pick Claude 4 Sonnets and then start talking to it using generally good prompting techniques. And in terms of prompting techniques, a lot of the stuff you probably heard before, but you want to be as explicit as you can. Don't let the AI make too many decisions. So we're talking about tic-tac-toe. It's better if you specify the different types of players, the features you want. Do you want a reset button? Do you want to have a new game? All these kind of things, it's good to consider those up front and then put them into a document that's clear, that's concise, and that doesn't really contradict itself. That's going to give the AI the best chance possible to make your life easier and actually make changes. And when you want to work with GitHub, it's important to save early and save often. Again, it's kind of like you're in a video game, you're on the final boss. If you worked at a level for 2 hours and then you die at the end, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Well, with Git and GitHub, it's pretty similar. If you never are saving, and if you have the AI make 50 changes, and then on the 51st change, it completely bricks your app, well, good luck untangling that mess if you didn't make a checkpoint. So when in doubt, just make more commits. The good news is the AI will know what to do. It can make changes. It can actually add nice commit messages. And if you run into issues where you want to revert, which is go back in time to a different commits, you can have the AI help you through that as well. And that's why in this video I wanted to highlight a lot of the terminology and high-level concepts, because even just knowing that some of this stuff exists makes it a lot more useful to you, because the AI can hold your hand through this type of stuff. So now instead of saying, I want to import my product from Lovable, you can say, hey, pull the changes from GitHub and make sure that everything's in sync. You can be a lot more explicit and reduce the chances of an error with the AI. Anyway, that was the tutorial for today. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you guys learned something about GitHub. I want you to think about how GitHub is really like a Google Drive for code, and how it's really the central place. And I also, even if code itself is scary, so even if you have no idea what's in these files, I want us to think about how code as files are very familiar. And I'm actually even going to go in, let's go into Finder so I can show you guys that code is just normal files. So we're going to go into my folder here, and we're going to change it to my favorites column view. We're going to go into, what's that, code. And what was this called? It was called tic-tac-toe, something weird, tic-tac-toe. Oops. All of the files are here. These are just regular files that exist on your computer. And if you deleted a file here, you'd have some issues. And when you want to clone a project, or rather download a project, you're going to get a copy of every single file. And that's why we have GitHub. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. If the video was helpful, leave a comment below. Thank you.